All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, Marty, are you ready?
I am ready.
All right, Here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Marti Smith. Marti, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored and glad to be here.
All right. Appreciate that. So Marti is an occupational therapist who specializes in somatosensory activity recommendations. She's worked closely with Dr. Bruce Perry and the Trust Based Relational Intervention educators since 2010 to instruct organizations on how trauma impacts the sensory systems. She's created a web-based assessment tool known by the acronym KALMAR, based on the NMT model, which is Bruce Perry's model, that provides free activity recommendations based on behaviors reported by the caregivers. And I'm sure we'll get more into that. Her recent book is titled The Therapist: Relating Through the Senses. It's a must-have resource for understanding how to rehabilitate sensory systems impacted by trauma. All right, Marti. Before we go in here, share with listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I am originally from Indiana. So grew up, parents were divorced. So Carmel, Indiana was mom's home, and Greencastle, Indiana was dad's home. So there was kind of the suburbs of Indianapolis, and then more out in the country and a little bit more rural Indiana. And then I graduated OT school and worked in the school systems in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is kind of on the Illinois border, and really learned how to work with a shoestring budget and not a lot of financial assistance and things like that. And so then met my husband online on eHarmony, and he moved me to Austin, Texas, because he works in tech. And tech for me was like a guy in his basement living with his mom. And so I was like, why can't you live in Indiana? He was like, there aren't jobs for me in Indiana. And so he was saying I could live in Chicago or LA or New York or all these places. And I was like, I'm kind of, I'm not a farm girl, but I like to think I'm a farm girl because I grew up in Indiana. And so Austin, when we moved here back in 2003, it was a little more country feeling. Now it feels like small San Diego, but when we moved here, it was a nice small town compromise. So he could do his big tech stuff and I could do my
very cool
OT stuff.
So
yeah.
OT, occupational therapy, give our listeners just a brief summarization of what that is.
That's the best career in the world. Is the brief synopsis. It's basically looking at a person's functioning throughout their lifespan, and you can work at any point with someone in any setting, and it's analyzing their activities of daily living, the things that they want to do, and figuring out how to help them achieve the goals of doing those things. So it is about looking at tasks, looking at situations, and saying, where's the hitch in the giddy up? And can we fix that? And can we move on? And, I tell people it's like nursing. You get a nursing degree, you could work at a school nurse, or you could be a medvac, and you wouldn't want your school nurse in your medvac helicopter, and you probably wouldn't want the medvac nurse at the school. And so OT is the same way. I specialize in sensory processing. One of my best friends from OT school is a hand therapist. You wouldn't want me working on your hand, and you probably wouldn't want my friend working with your child who has had trauma, right? So it's a lot of our continuing ed is what leads us into where we're going to go.
Okay.
But it's a very generalist field, and we do everything from working in the NICU to working with spinal cord injuries to working in the school systems, nursing homes. I personally work at a care farm, which is kind of an interesting field. I work with animals and plants, and I have a high population of people who are either foster or adopted, or they've experienced trauma in their background.
Oh.
And so they come to me because, you've read Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. You've, talked about Bruce Perry's model, Dr. Perry's model of, the neurosequential, where you have to calm the brainstem and things like that. I live in the brainstem a lot, and that limbic system. And so because of my trainings, I kind of use the animals and the land and nature and help calm those sensory systems so that the kids can then function in school, in their relationships. And, so I work on those base skills.
Okay. Well, we're going to dive more into that in detail, but let me just pause you for a second and say, I have a lot of respect for OTs. When I was working at a clinic in Northern California, we were assessing and treating young kids who were showing early signs of psychosis. We had a team, a multidisciplinary team, and there were a couple OTs on there, and I was like, well, what's an OT? But
what's the occupation of a kid? They don't work, right?
Excuse me. Yeah, but I tell you, I grew to really appreciate and respect the work that you folks do. So I just want to say that. Yeah. All right. Why OT? What got you there?
Yeah. So my father is a physician, small town family doctor, and my mother was a middle school math and Spanish teacher. And so I loved, because my dad was in rural Indiana, everyone knew him. So, if you're ever with dad, people were talking medicine, and I loved the chatter. I'm fascinated by the human body. I love neuroanatomy. I loved gross anatomy, was one of my favorite classes, because I was like, oh, I get to feel all these muscles and see these structures and really understand how the body works, and love that. Several of my siblings did go into medicine and become doctors or physician assistants. And so we have a very medical family, but I noticed that a lot of them were tied to their beepers. And my own father was absent a lot because he was working so hard, literally saving lives. And so I loved my mom's schedule of being a teacher and being off in the summers. And I like to scuba dive and I like to travel, and, I like to have that free time. And so I thought I would be a special ed teacher. And when I did an internship or a practicum in high school, I met some kids with cerebral palsy, and I thought, no, I love these kids, and I love trying to figure out how to adapt things so that they can be independent, and how can I make adaptive equipment or just change their positioning or use my body to, co-regulate with them and bring out, because back in the 90s, these kids were, somewhat trapped in their bodies, right? We didn't have the assistive technology that we do. We didn't have the strategies and the methods that we have now. And so for me, I fell in love with that population, and I was like, I want to unlock the minds of these children. And
so how old were you when you realized
I was 18.
this?
18.
That's pretty amazing to have, you said several of your siblings go into a field, because it's very easy to be swept away and be lured. Becoming a physician has a certain cachet with it. Right. But for you, I think, to say, wait a minute, it points to a certain level of self-awareness you had.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is too, I mean, it's a family practice. Like my father's practice is a family practice. Like a lot of the people that work there are the family. And what is interesting though, is they do amazing things. And I love that my siblings all chose that path, and they're all brilliant, and they literally save lives on a daily basis. The two things though that I had that self-awareness, I guess, that you talk about, was I didn't like the hours. I didn't like going to the grocery store and having somebody ask me about the rash on their hand.
Right.
I didn't want that lifestyle where I was never off. Right.
Yeah.
And I also, they had so much pressure. I mean, people literally, they would come home and be like, I might lose this patient. And with occupational therapy, there are settings where we do lose patients, and that does happen. But for the most part, especially if you're in the school system, people don't die on my watch. And I really can only make people better for the most part. Now, there are things I could do that would hurt someone, but it would almost have to be intentional. And so I kind of looked at OT as a career of, wow, like I will help people every day and I won't have as much heartache as if I'm dealing with the bigger processes and bigger, Something else I was thinking though that I wanted to say too was, unless you are that small town family doctor, it's really hard to develop the relationships with your patients and clients. And that is something I do think my siblings do well, is they have good relationships with their clients. But in general, most doctors, they see someone for 20 minutes
Right.
and they are pressured to diagnose and treat and then get them out, and the turnover is very quick. Whereas with occupational therapy, I get an hour 3 times a week with these people for
Right.
6 to 12 weeks. And so I really get to know them. I really get to know their families. I can go really deep in their care. And so for me, that was more appealing than the physician, where, it's quicker and there's more pressure to see more people.
So you get into a program, occupational therapy program.
Mm-hmm.
What happens? What do you start learning that starts to make these synapses go off for you?
I started learning about sensory processing, and there was an element of, I think I have this. This explains a lot, like I don't like textures, and
Right.
sometimes do bother me, and there's a name for that, and it's not just the name of when you're doing abnormal psych and you're like, oh, I have obsessive disorder, oh, I have this, it's oh, I really do have this, and so that was fun for me to kind of learn why my body reacts the way it does to some things. And again, this is back in 1996. So we did not know near as much as we do about autism. We did not know near as much as we do about trauma. And so going through school, I really kind of prepared myself to work with cerebral palsy in the school system. And then I got into the school system, and that's when the bubble broke for me. And I realized, I only have 2 kids with the diagnosis of cerebral palsy, and I have like 45 diagnosed as autism. And then it was like, if I'm going to be good at my job, then I need to lean further into the sensory systems and the sensory processing and what makes people behave the way that they do a little bit more, and more behavioral analysis. And at that time, applied behavior analysis was a really big deal. And I did some of it. I don't do as much now, but at the time, you're learning a lot of those systems. And, thankfully now I've moved more into the relational care and things like that. But I became really good with working with autism. And so, and it wasn't really my first choice, but once I started working with these kids, I really fell in love with them, and just the quirky, fun things that they say, and just really getting to know their families and just their intentions,
Right.
and being able to view the lens of, this kid isn't really trying to upset the teacher. Like, the kid's not even aware the teacher's in the room. This isn't personal at all, right?
Right.
Like, everybody thinks it's so personal, and it's like, it's not personal at all. Like, there's something going on in his nervous system that we need to investigate. And maybe if we calm down his nervous system, then he'll be more pleasant to be around, and he'll feel better in his body
Right.
too. And so that's when I started really leaning into autism and learning about that. And then that's how I found Dr. Perry. And, he asked me to bring that component to his trauma work in the neurosequential model of therapeutics. So, but
Okay, well, hang on. So I'm sure there's a story between you learning about Dr. Perry and him saying, come on over
there's
here.
a really good story about that. You would love
Okay.
that story.
Well, let's hear that. Well, first of all, so
Yeah.
where did you start? How did you start to learn about Bruce Perry?
Well, he called me.
Okay.
That's where I learned about him.
Okay.
And he actually, my husband was working with the brother of Jana Rosenfeld, who's the co-developer, has worked very closely alongside with Dr. Perry to develop the NMT. So they needed a developer. They needed a software guy. And so Jana looked at her brother, and her brother was retired, but Rob, my husband, used to work with her brother. And so her brother was telling Jana, oh, Rob's the best software engineer ever, anywhere. And he happens to work in Texas. So call him up. So at the time I was having a baby, or I had a baby, and Rob starts working for this guy named Bruce Perry, who I've never met. And all I know is they're just spending so many hours on the phone, and they're building this metric. And so Rob would ask me, he would say, come look at this. This is sensory stuff. Like, I think you'd really get into this. And I was like, I'm a baby. Like, I have no interest in this. And he was like, well, he's talking about the brainstem, and Marty, you love the brainstem. Like, how should I pitch this to Bruce? I'm gonna talk to Bruce tomorrow. How should I help him organize this? And I was like, I don't know, you can put this there or that there. And pretty soon, Dr. Perry was like, you seem to know a lot about the brain, Rob, not just like development, right? And he was like, oh, that's my wife. She's been kind of guiding.
Oh my God, that's so funny.
Things like that. Yeah. And so then he says, well, I want to meet your wife. And Rob was like, you need to meet my wife. And so Rob really tried to get us together. And I really didn't want to meet him. And this is all in my book too. And so I had a friend that was over who wanted me to work with her son, who was adopted. And because she knew I was good with the sensory systems, and Bruce happened to call at that time while I was working with them. And her name is Julie Corey, and she's real big into the trauma world. And so she goes, are you telling me Dr. Bruce Perry is talking to your husband at like 9:00 at night? Like right now? And I was like, yes, they do this all the time. She's like, you know who he is?
So great.
And I was like, no, I don't know who he is. I don't care who he is. Like, and she's like, you need to meet him. And I was like, I don't think I do, because I'm really busy. And so, and I was doing a lot of trainings. I was already traveling all over the country presenting on autism. And so anyway, Rob finally got the two of us together, and Bruce called me and he said, do you want to, he's like, I love the things that you're bringing, through Rob, and I need someone to help me with the activity component, which is OT, which is what you are. And I was like, yeah, but I'm really happy with where I am, and, all these things. And then he says, well, I do a lot of work in Australia. So I said, well, if you can get me to Australia, I will join your team.
Wow.
And I've taught in Australia using his model. And then it was like this awakening of, he gave me all the videos, and he says, okay, we're going to start this thing called the NMT. Everybody's going to watch all these videos. We're going to do these metrics. We're going to use your husband's, thing that, we developed together. And so I'm watching all these videos that you have to do the training, and it just wrecked me, because I realized how much of my own baggage, and I'm listening to all these things, and I knew development, I knew neuroanatomy, but the way he put it together of, if you've had this adverse experience, it's going to change things. And I've always thought of like strokes and head injuries and more static things later in life, but that early trauma affecting your growth patterns and things was a little eye-opening. Well, very eye-opening.
Go if you are willing, just go there for a minute. What wrecked you specifically? What was it?
I think because I did not have the most optimal upbringing. And when Dr. Perry would say something like, if the mother does XYZ, then the baby will do XYZ. And I had these moments of realization of like, oh my gosh, that's me. And then I would have these realizations of, and that's my child. And so not only could I see the things he talked about in my past, but I could see how I was replicating them with my own child. And it wrecked me, because then, here I am, we're a very well-to-do family, white suburbia. There's no trauma, with us, and the baby was wanted and all these things. And yet by some of Bruce's standards, like my own kid could have, quote unquote childhood trauma. I had a difficult birth. I had, I won't get into too much of my story here, but, there were a lot of things that he would talk about that I could relate to that I never considered as trauma, and it gives me this empathy of working with these parents who have these kids who had poor birth stories, and it was not intentional at all, and as I'm leaning more into foster and adopt and things like that, much of it isn't intentional. And that changed my view too of, shaken baby syndrome. I've worked with kids with shaken baby syndrome, and I had such judgment for those parents. And why would you shake a baby? Like, that's terrible. And then you get to the point where you're like, oh, I know why you shake a baby.
Right.
And by the grace of God, I did not,
and
I
think a lot of parents could empathize with that.
Well, and true. And then it's like, and then you listen to Dr. Perry's videos and his teachings and stuff, and you realize that these people didn't have the capacity to not shake the baby, and so then it just changes your outlook of how you approach your clients. And in my training, I do a lot of trainings too. And so that's part of what I try and bring to my trainings, is that empathy piece of everybody's doing the best they can. And like Robin Goebel, is very good about saying, you're doing you're keeping your nervous system safe, and we do a lot of work together because our work is so aligned and what we're teaching and things like that too. Yeah.
What a crazy, fortuitous, inspiring story that was. Oh my
Isn't
gosh.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And people always laugh. They're like, Dr. Perry called you. And it's like, yeah, and I wouldn't take the call. And now I know who he is. And I've been in his circle and I've seen people just fawn over him at conferences and things like that. And it's so funny to me because it's like, wow, I had no idea. And it just proves you don't know who someone is unless you're in their circle,
Right. Right.
And so my daughter laughs and teases me because she's like, my mommy's really famous, but she can go to HEB in her pajamas and nobody knows who she is. So I'm like, that's the perfect kind of famous right there, where you're famous to a very small group of people.
Let me just remind everyone that I was speaking with, excuse me, Marti Smith, occupational therapist. Her book, The Connected Therapist, Relating Through the Senses. Why did you write this book?
Because I was asked to. I got a lot of questions of, as I would be finishing a lecture, or a seminar, or, presentation, and people would say, well, where can I go for more information? And, I loved the Raising a Sensory Smart Child by Lindsay Beal. That's a good one. I love Dr. Vanderkort's The Body Keeps the Score. That was a really good, Dr. Perry's Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. Like I would give these books, but there wasn't a book for OTs that combined trauma and somatosensory. And so in the back of my mind, I was like, okay, I should write that book. And then Dr. David Cross works at the Trust Based Relational Intervention, TCU's TBRI method. And he asked me to write an appendix for their manual to do the practitioner training. And I said, well, I got a lot I want to tell people. And he says, well, write as much as you can. And so I did. And then he was like, I think there's more in you. I think you could tie your personal story to this and make it really powerful. And he says, have you considered writing a book? And I said, well, I have, but that's not my thing. I don't read. When you get to my book recommendations, I think you'll be delighted to hear what I recommend, because I'm not a reader. I'm just not that person. I don't like it. I'd rather scuba dive or hike or, something like that, more active. And so anyway, he kind of convinced me, and he says, well, if you'll write this book, we'll advertise for you and we'll sell it to the practitioners. And, and I said, fine, I'll write it, but then I don't want anything to do with it. He was like, deal. So then Michael Rimley, who you've had on here a couple of times, he and I are two peas in a pod. We met at a symposium that Dr. Perry was teaching at, and he was waiting for Dr. Perry to sign some horse that he was carrying around, like a little flat Stanley thing. And I happened to be up there because Rob was in a meeting with Dr. Perry. And so we were in the waiting room together and hit it off like two peas in a pod. And he's one of my dearest friends now. And so anyway, I was talking to Michael, and he wanted to do this Rising Tide, and which is amazing. And he's really turned it into something great. And so I was going to be one of his speakers. And I said, well, Dr. Cross asked me to write this book, and he was like, do it by Rising Tide. And I was like, Michael, it's like April and Rising Tide's in June. And he's like, I know you can do it, Marty, you can do it.
Oh my gosh.
Like, okay. So we have an RV, and I took the RV to a campsite, and I would spend Wednesday nights at this campsite and write this book. And then I met this friend named Holly Timberline, who's amazing. She's in this group that we're trying to launch. We're actually hoping in the next few weeks to have an alliance for trauma responsive OTs up and going, a website for OTs to come and find more trauma minded people. Terry Barney is in there with me. There's a group of about 5 of us, and she's been on your podcast as well. She was the first OT that you ever had.
Yeah,
and awesome. So she told me to tell you hi. And so anyway, there's a couple of us in that group, and Holly used to be an editor. And so we're bonded trying to start this nonprofit together. And then Holly was like, I'll edit it for you. And I was like, perfect. Wow. So in 2 months' time, I wrote a book and put it on Amazon and became a bestseller.
That's incredible.
So
who's the book for?
The book is written for both parents and practitioners. Holly and I both worked really hard to make the language very accessible, so that I talk about the proprioceptive system, but then I just say it's just receptors in your joints that are stimulated when you move and squeeze things, right? I talk about gate control theory, but then I just say it's just an override of putting pressure on your thumb, right? And so I talk about these concepts, but I make them very easily accessible. And I want it to be read by parents to give them a foundation of maybe some of the symptoms of why the child is behaving the way they are. Maybe it's not intentional, maybe it's a sensory based thing, so that they can go to their OT and say, could this be a thing? And relating to the parents of kids can be really hard. And even for an OT like myself, I struggled with trying to understand kids. And then for the practitioner, the second half, so the first half of the book is kind of my journey from that applied behavior analysis into more trust-based relational intervention and the neurosequential model. And then the second half is, okay, OTs, you're getting these kids from trauma. You can't look at them like you look at a kid with CP. Here are these other factors that you have to consider because of how their brain formed due to the adversity. And here are actual techniques and tips to do that. And that's one of the things that if you look at the Amazon reviews and people that come up to me and talk to me, they love the practical tips. And so, I had a therapist email me and she said she had the book sitting on her side table and her daughter struggles with sleep. And so she came in and she goes, Mommy, what's this book? Because it's got my daughters on the cover and she's real cute and they're in blue bonnets and stuff. And the little girl said, what's this book? And the mom says, oh, it's a book this OT is trying to help me help kids. And she opened it up and read the sleep page. And in there, I just give suggestions anybody can use. You don't need fancy stuff. And so Marconi Union has a song on Spotify called Weightless. And it's been studied at universities and stuff to help people sleep. And so that's one of the tips that I give is the Marconi Union Weightless. And the little girl says, can we try this? And the mom was like, sure. And the mom was like, she went right to sleep.
Wow.
She says, I was reading this book for the kids that I work with, but it helped my daughter, and so that's amazing for me to hear that is that I wrote this book because Dr. Cross was like, you should just write the stuff, because they never give me enough time to talk. And he's like, if I could give you unlimited talk, what would you say to people? And I was like, okay, I would say this.
Right.
And then I sat in my camper and acted like I was having coffee with a parent and a therapist. And
When you say therapist, do you mean occupational therapist or?
I do mean occupational therapist, okay. But so many social workers, psychologists, school counselors, they love this book. It's absolutely crazy. The Texas Juvenile Justice Department, one of their directors has purchased it for all of their caseworkers, and they've all read it. They did a big book study on it. And so like anybody can read this book.
That's awesome. What, that song Weightless, who was it by?
Marconi Union.
Marconi.
I can play it for you now if you want. I've got Spotify up. And it's just a really interesting, and it has graphics that goes with it. So it's Marconi Union Weightless. It's an 8-minute song. And this is what it sounds like. If it'll go. Yeah. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
So it has a build up, but do you feel the heartbeat?
Yep.
In that? But the heartbeat is kind of that 60 beat per minute. And so if your mind is racing and you're thinking of things, then your heartbeat's going to speed up. Right. And what happens when you play music that matches your heart, like that has a lower beat, your heartbeat will sync to that. And that's why music is such a motivator. And when you're trying to do something, you'll put in music that has a certain tempo, and then you'll feel a different way. So if I wanted kids to clean up their room, I wouldn't come in and be like, clean up, clean up, it's clean up, you want to get the energy going. And so that's one of the things I talk about in the book. And I'm not trying to sell the book. I've paid the cost of my book. I don't care if I sell the book ever. I'll give you a free one if you meet me in person. But it's that I want people to understand, like, if you listen to Lady Gaga, it's going to evoke a feeling in you.
Right.
And that's a really simple intervention to do with somebody. And if you listen to Mozart, you might have to go to the bathroom. and it's because of the way the music is structured. And so the book is kind of like, well, why? It's because it's of the tempo, and it's because of the emotional feeling that the song will evoke. If I played something, you look like you're about my age. I believe when I stalked you, you were in your 40s like I am. And so if I were to play like Bruce Springsteen or something like that, you might go back to your childhood, and you would have certain, James Taylor might bring in family moments because that's what your parents listened to.
Exactly.
And so, so the book is really about how do we use sensory in my life, my passion, if you will. This is my passion, is how do we find activities that speak to people, and then how do we understand why they speak to people and why they change. Because if I have an association with Neil Diamond because it reminds me of my father, and we dance to Neil Diamond all the time. But if my father was an alcoholic and he always listened to a Neil Diamond record as he was drinking, I'm going to have a very different association. So I can't be the therapist that says, hey, you guys, Neil Diamond cures everybody because it cured me. You have to understand why it cures me. And then you have to understand why it won't cure somebody else. But maybe that person had a bus driver that always played, I'll say Dr. Hook. You probably don't know who that is.
I do know who Dr. Hook is.
I love Dr. Hook. Yeah. But maybe your bus driver played Dr. Hook. And so for that person, the cover of the Rolling Stones song is going to be like, hey, I know how, rock and roll, right? They're gonna feel that, and that's going to evoke a positive memory for them. And so really my job as the occupational therapist is to say what sensory input is coming in, and what does it base to? How does the body react to that, right? Because certain substances and certain things will automatically influence you no matter who you are. Right. But then how do we view that through the lens of trauma? Because if you smell smoke, your first response is going to be alert. And you're going to be like, it's a fire. Where is the fire? But if you add the context of a campground, then that smoke could actually calm you down. Right. And so understanding smoke is an alerting sensation, but if you understand the context around it, it's more nuanced than that. And so I try and break down those nuances for people.
Wow. Marti, you're incredible. You are. I mean, you're so inspiring. I mean, you asked me why I keep doing this, and this is it. I mean, look at you. Come on.
I love my job. I really do.
Well, it's clear. It's clear you do. I mean, and
I work with people like Michael and Robin. Like, come on, it's a dream team, right?
That's awesome. I'm so glad you came on here. So we got your book again, The Connected Therapist, Relating Through the Senses. Do you have any other go-to book recommendations?
I do.
Okay.
Tell you, I set them aside so that I wouldn't forget. I've got 3 that I have to tell you.
Okay.
One, where is it? And this one will change your life.
Okay, I like that.
Have you seen Heart and Brain?
Heart
from
and
the
Brain.
Awkward Yeti?
Okay.
Have you seen this one?
No.
His actual name is Nick Seeluck, I believe is his name. This is amazing. He has a Facebook page and he does daily comics. Wow. And he does calendars and all kinds of stuff. But the Heart and Brain, and it's body based. So this is his little character and he has all these things. But basically you have the heart and the brain like doing stories. Okay. Right? And I wish I could.
Is it a kid's book?
No,
okay.
It's not. So my brother, who's a physician, I believe was the one that told me about this. There's a game on Amazon called Organ Attack, and Nick developed this game. And so the idea is you have all these organs and then you play cards against your friends and you harvest people's organs or you kill off their organs. And so the person who has the last organ is the winner. And it's really fun. And it talks about like all the different diseases that can attack the different systems. And it's very knowledge-based and stuff like that. And so, but then heart, even on the brain, like heart is drawn towards utter nonsense and the brain is drawn towards adult responsibilities. And so his comics are always between heart saying like, oh, this looks amazing. And then brain going, heart, we have to do work. Right, and then heart going, but this is amazing. And it's this beautiful cartoon. Every day you get a new one. And it's all about how we need that balance in our life of the whimsy of the heart and then the responsibility of the brain. And my husband and I love it because he is brain and I am heart. And it's, all about, do we shop our feeling, or do we buy our feelings or eat our feelings, and then tongue comes in and, will influence what they eat. And it's hilarious. Like change your life. If you listen to nothing else I tell you today,
oh my gosh,
Google Heart and Brain.
Wow.
See a comic, and
Okay.
if you're in trauma at all and love brain science, you're going to love it. See, you're wanting to do it right now.
I'm doing it right now. I'm
It
connecting
is
it up.
because it's so good.
Heart and brain. All right, here we go.
Right. And I even have like signed things because my husband's love language is gifts. And so he's always telling Nick to like send me a heart or like send me little fun things. I love
Okay.
it.
All right. Got it linked up. All right. What
Okay.
else?
The next one that I have for you is what I rely on a lot in my own practice. And they're ridiculous, but they're called the Your Child At series. And these kids, look at them, they're from the 70s.
Okay.
They're like old books. Yeah, like ISBNs are probably in the 70s. Like it's ridiculous. But you have your 3-year-old, your 5-year-old, your 9-year-old. Each of these books goes through what is typical development. And so often we lose sight. Like the 5-year-old, I get a lot of calls for 5-year-olds that are showing themselves. And they're all like, he's been sexually abused.
Right.
And it's like, okay, every 5-year-old plays doctor.
Right.
And every 5-year-old does the you show me, I'll show you yours. And every 5-year-old is fascinated by National Geographic, right? Like they're curious. And so it's not necessarily meaning that, so these books are just really good at what is the typical life stage for these kids. And that's a really good frame of reference for me as I look through. I get the question a lot, is this trauma or is this normal? Right. And those books really help me sort that out. So
awesome.
The second, it's a book series that I use a lot. And then the third one that I really love is the Belly Button book. This is a children's book. Have you read it? You've not read it?
I haven't read that one.
Okay. Anything by Sandra Boynton. I love Sandra Boynton. And this is a little delightful book. It's a children's. You can see how ratted and tatted it is because I read it to my kids all the time. And I read it to anybody that'll come to my house. But it's about this sweet little hippopotamus. It's this tiny hippopotamus has something small to say. And if we're very quiet, she'll say it right away. Listen. And then the hippopotamus goes, beep-o. And so it has a belly button. And it talks about where the belly button goes. And they love to go to Belly Button Beach. And so anything that Sandra Boynton writes has the cadence for connection. And it has that rhythmosity of snuggling with the child and having it be like, this tiny hippopotamus has something small to say, and then you lean in and then you do the little beep. And so it's just this delightful dance of rhythm and serve and return. And I live a lot in the like be high arousal and then be low arousal, and so we want kids to be able to be really excited and also be calm. And the kids I work with, they get stuck and they're really excited, or they get stuck and they're really calm. And so to teach them how to move through that rhythm is very important. And so Sandra Boynton is one of my favorite authors, and any of her books are just delightful in their rhythm, and she's got songs that go with them and all that. So those are my 3 books: Heart and Brain, Your Child, and
we'll have them all linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Look, I got to have you back at a later time. Love to have you back. You are just not only inspiring, but just filled with energy and passion. And I love it. And I'm so glad you came on here, Marti.
Oh, good. I'm glad to be here.
All right.
It is like I saw you. I've been doing this for 15 years and you've been doing this for a long time too. And when you first came out, I was like, I need to get on that guy's podcast. And then when Michael was on there, I was like, Michael, get on there. And then Robin's on there. And I was like, y'all starting to drop my name. I need to meet this guy. He seems really cool. So thanks for finally, having me.
You're so welcome. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Not.
No.
And I don't mean that mean. I'm just terrible at correspondence. They can go to my website, creativetherapies.com.
Okay. There
is a contact us button on there. And that is me. When they hit contact us, it is me. I don't have any staff or anything like that. So, but I also tell people be the squeaky wheel and keep contacting me, because unless I'm expecting something from you, probably the third time is the charm. Okay. And if you're persistent, then I'll get back with you. But
Marti, thank you so much for doing this. You're amazing.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate
All right.
it.
We'll be in touch.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.